Hello, everyone. Welcome to VRIC Media, your most trusted voice in metals and mining. I'm your host, Darrell Thomas, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing JP Cortez, who serves as the Executive Director of Sound Money Defense League, who focuses on public policy, nonpartisan, and focuses on defending real money, sound money, America's constitutional money, gold and silver. How you doing today, JP?
Hey, Darrell, thank you for having me on, man. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, indeed. So tell us more about the league and what you all do and just some of your why behind why did you want to get into this work?
So the Sound Money Defense League was started in 2014. It's a project of Money Metals Exchange. They're a national online bullion dealer and depository. And when I was coming out of college, I had studied at the Mises Institute, which is like a free market Austrian economics think tank. Learning a lot about Ron Paul, Ludwig von Mises, Rothbard, Hayek. And I came out of college as a young college grad, and I realized, after having studied sound money for so long, and I kind of realized that money has an outsized impact on societies, on the way individuals interact, on the way countries interact. And what we have today is political money. It's money by government edict. It's unbacked. It's paper money. And that's compared to things like sound money or constitutional money, in this case, gold and silver. So we realized coming out that there were a lot of impediments from people getting into buying gold and silver, selling gold and silver, getting to use it as money. So with all this friction that stands in the way, it's not really possible today, as current law stands, to use gold and silver as money. We're going around state to state and to Washington, D.C., trying to change that, trying to remove all of the impediments, the thistle and the briar that stand in the way of people innovating within this space of money. This is a space that has been frozen in time for decades because the government has a monopoly on it. But if we remove some of the government barriers standing in the way of smart people innovating in this space, we might find that there's better money than this paper devaluing note that we have to use, that we're forced into using. And that was kind of the basis for the Sound Money Defense League, realizing that there was a lot to be done as far as policy goes to help reinstate and to help people readopt their own personal gold standards.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that's some great work. Sounds like you all are doing there. So let's dive into that a little more. So why are these states, implementing, regulations and such to make it harder for folks to use sound money or to, transfer their dollars into sound money and such and things of that nature? So what's kind of the motive or the reason behind that?
The good news is it's not that politicians are like against sound money or against gold and silver. In most cases, what I've seen over 10 years of doing this is that they're simply uneducated. There are nearly 8,000 elected state officials across the United States, across the 50 state legislatures, most of which had never heard the term sound money, had ever really asked those questions like, what is money? Why do we use it? Where is its value derived from? And these are really critical and frankly fundamental conversations and questions that most politicians, either at the state or the federal level, have never really had. So over the last 10 years, it's been an enormous education campaign. And what we found is that some politicians in some states are definitely understanding it now, and they're more active and they're passing laws like this. But in some cases, the ones who still dig their heels in, these are tax revenue hungry politicians. They see a sector or an industry and they see dollar signs. How many dollars can we extract from these productive people is what government officials, government people who are thinking about the government's coffers, that's what they're thinking. But unfortunately, that doesn't consider, that's a very static analysis. That's like first level analysis. But if you look further, you'll see that by implementing things like sales tax and capital gains tax on gold and silver, you have less businesses, less coin shops, less conventions, tourism dollars leave the state. All of these otherwise taxed items, as far as like coin cases, coin flips, coin books, all of these items that would otherwise be taxable, the state is losing all that revenue because people are just driving to their nearest border. They're leaving the state, they're leaving this bad jurisdiction to go to places that do not have this tax. Fortunately, today, 44 states have exempted precious metals purchases from sales tax. So in most cases, you can just drive to your nearest border because the overwhelming amount of states have already eliminated this. Next, we're moving on to capital gains. And those two are the primary points of friction, right? Like when you buy precious metals, you're getting taxed. Then when you use it, you're getting taxed again by the state and the federal government. There's so much friction. It's not possible, frankly, for it to work as money at all. So we're going around removing all of that and educating legislators while we do it.
That's good to hear. So I do want to pick on a few states, especially the state I live in, Washington State. I saw that laws being implemented in 2026 for taxes on purchases of precious metals and such. And so I've been just trying to get ahead of the curve, letting some friends know and such, figuring out some alternative sources if I need to make some purchases next year or whatnot. But we're going from no tax to having a tax. And so could you share a little bit more to that? And what are some of the other states that may have some more of these egregious policies that are pretty much, taxing Americans?
It's absolutely brutal, and it's really unfortunate that Washington did this. I've actually personally traveled to Olympia several times to testify in hearings out there at the state legislature level on repealing this tax. For several years now, those tax revenue politicians over there in Olympia have been trying to impose tax on gold and silver. And for years now, we've fended them off, working with dealers and other people in the state. But unfortunately, this time the momentum was too strong. And unfortunately, it's not just contained to Washington. Maryland is another state that this year imposed a sales tax after having a long-standing exemption. So unfortunately, yes, some of these states are kind of looking at their tax coffers, their revenues, and they're saying in some cases, we are headed towards a fiscal cliff. We are in massive deficits. We need to find as much money as we possibly can. And they think that by taxing precious metals, they'll be able to bring in tens of hundreds of millions of dollars a year in tax revenue, which is simply ridiculous. It has no basis in reality, but these people believe that they can make this money by doing this, and so they're going to do it. The fortunate thing is that, like you mentioned, there are alternatives. If you're in one of these jurisdictions where your government doesn't like you as a sound money or a precious metals investor, you can go online and have it delivered to a state where there are favorable tax policies. For example, you're right by Washington. Money Metals has a depository there. You order online, you have it shipped to the depository. The state of Washington isn't getting a cut of that. And so many other places around the country are doing that. They're facilitating those transactions because people who are buying gold and silver don't want to pay the cost of the item and then the cost of the premium and then anywhere from 5 to 9% tax on top of that. Just at that point, even as an investment, not even as just money, as an investment, it makes it hard to get a return. So the state, really stacks the deck against precious metals dealers, owners, investors. And so, the places like Washington, places like Maryland, in Ohio, for example, they have what we call dealer harassment laws. So in some states, you are not allowed, there are restrictions placed on the precious metals dealers themselves. So if you walk into a coin shop, for example, there are some states that say no cash transactions. We need digital transactions for everything you're doing here, which is crazy. There isn't really other places where that's the case. If I walk into a local coin shop in some of these states and I say, hey, Darrell, do you mind? I want to sell you this Silver Eagle. You'll say, okay, sure. You'll buy it from me. And then you'll take my name down. You'll take my phone number, my email address, my height, my weight, my hair color, my glasses, any tattoos, any notable scars. And then every day, legally, you would be required to upload all of that information into a police database. And that information sits there for who knows how long and who knows what they do with it. So it's a massive privacy. There are massive privacy implications here that harm the investors, that harm the dealers. And so we're going around, like I mentioned, removing some of these. But to be sure, some of these states are pretty galling about some of their policies, not just on the tax stuff, but on the regulation stuff. And then actually earlier this year, we had a great example in Kentucky where we duly passed the law. The legislature passed the law eliminating sales tax on gold and silver. And the governor said no. So he vetoed the bill. But the attorney general came back and said, hey, you don't have the power to veto this bill. The Constitution doesn't grant you this power because this is a revenue bill. The Constitution says you can only veto appropriations bills. And the governor of Kentucky said, I don't care. I'm doing it anyway, and I'm directing my administrations, my offices, to continue collecting the tax. And if dealers don't collect the tax, we are going to subject them to fines and penalties of all sorts. So we have even, at the highest levels of government, people ignoring the will of the people, governors acting extrajudiciously, overstepping the power that the Constitution gives them, because many people just don't understand, or in this case, this is just a tyrannical politician, Governor Beshear in Kentucky, who clearly has shown no respect for the Constitution. So, we're fighting these battles, and sometimes it's an education thing, sometimes it's that people don't understand it or that they think that it's a bad thing. But more than anything, what we're looking here for is choice. Man, we're living in a world, it's kind of crazy. Americans and in most other countries, really, there's a variety of choice. When you wake up, you get to choose the kind of material you want your t-shirts to be made of. You get to choose your breakfast. You get to choose the car you drive. And there are models of all different kinds to meet all different flavors and perspectives and desires. Mm-hmm. But in one instance, that choice doesn't exist. And that's money, right? We're trapped in this system. No one woke up this morning and said, man, I really like the monetary features that the Federal Reserve note has. I want to actively use this as money. We're trapped. We're legally and regulatorily trapped into using the Federal Reserve note. And so on, the Federal Reserve note and its power to be printed unlimitedly is what enables a lot of the worst things that happen that the government is doing in our name. Everything from bloated and growing bureaucracies to wars of choice all over the world. All of this happens because the government has the power to print endlessly. And that's what makes gold and silver, frankly, bullish. We're looking around, we're looking at central banks all over the world stockpiling gold. We're looking at states, too, also developing gold stockpiles. If states are doing it, if central banks are doing it, it makes sense for an individual to be doing it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And so that's a perfect segue to the topic of de-dollarization. I've been seeing some headlines about some states making gold and silver legal tender. I'm even looking on Sound Money Defense League's website, and I see that you all have posted some articles on some states doing this. And could you speak to that? Like what's happening there?
Yeah, so as you may know, as your listeners likely know, the gold and silver are the only form of money mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 10 says that no state shall make anything but gold and silver a tender in the payment of debt. So paper money is not allowed per the U.S. Constitution. And of course, that's understandable. The framers of the Constitution, coming out of the Constitutional Convention, loudly spoke about the perils of paper money, about how dangerous it is, about how it gives government the power to steal from its people. And so they knew from the very beginning the risks and the dangers that came with this paper money. And so states now are reaffirming the constitutional mandate that says that gold and silver are in fact money. And on top of this reaffirmation, they're also actively stockpiling it themselves. This year, Wyoming established a $10 million physical gold reserve. They're buying physical gold to store in their states because they're looking at their balance sheets and they're saying, whoa, our balance sheet is loaded with dollar-denominated debt, much of which has real negative rates of return. So we have to do something else. And of course, the same way states are doing, the same way central banks are doing, the same way some businesses are doing, the same way individuals are doing, people are coalescing around a non-inflatable and politically neutral money, and that's gold and silver. So Wyoming was the most recent to establish this reserve. Last year, Utah established or approved rather a $180 million, I believe, appropriation for physical gold stored within the state. Ohio currently owns paper gold. It's a gold ETF, but it is exposure to gold, though physical is obviously preferred because it defends against counterparty risk. So, more and more, we're seeing states now readopt this. At the same time, what we're seeing is the federal government have to answer questions about their own gold in ways that they haven't had to in decades. There's a spotlight on America's gold holdings, auditing Fort Knox, that culminated earlier this year. You saw Elon Musk talking about it. You saw President Trump talking about it. We're going to go in there. We're going to make sure the gold is there. And frankly, they're right. And at a time where gold is becoming reemerging as a tier one monetary asset in both the literal and the figurative sense of the word, at a time where the gold and silver prices are jaw dropping. It feels like hitting new all-time highs every other day. America has to answer for the quality and the state of its own purported gold reserves. And we're working on legislation to do that as well at the federal level with the Gold Reserve Transparency Act. That was a bill that was introduced by Congressman Massey, Thomas Massey from Kentucky earlier this year, that it calls for the first real comprehensive audit that America's gold has had in at least 5 or 6 decades. So this would be a huge step forward in reestablishing trust between Americans and the monetary arm of the American government, and the American government and its standing with the rest of the world, allies and adversaries alike.
Timing's everything in this business. We've seen commodity prices really move up. The copper price, that started to move up strongly. We're not far off all-time highs, although you wouldn't know it from the junior sector and copper companies in general. But I think over the next year or two, we're going to see that really correct to the upside, and you're going to see a lot of money come into the sectors. Vizsla Copper, we're the team that brought you successes including ISO Energy and Vizsla Silver. If you want to learn more, you can find us at vizslacopper.com.
So I haven't looked into this myself, but I've seen other folks talk about, the gold has been audited in Fort Knox, it's there and such. And so what's the discrepancy there? I mean, for this bill to be introduced, what is that going to do outside of auditing the gold? Is it like a consistent audit, or what's happening there?
So I guess I'll start by saying so much of the information that's out there is misinformation. They're lying. You have Secretary Percent going on TV, and in his case, he's actually not lying. He's going on TV and saying, oh, no, I've seen the audits. I know they're there. I know we do them regularly. They're fine. That, it broadly, sure, might be true, but what he's talking about there is a schedule of the seals, not an actual audit. They're not going in, opening the box and confirming that the gold is in fact there. They're looking at the lock on the door and saying, nah, that lock is still there. We're good. But the issue is, as Jan Nieuwenhuis, who is a fantastic gold analyst for Money Metals, has done a ton of research on this that shows there have been multiple instances where boxes have been moved, boxes have been opened, seals have been broken, and there have not been any re-audits. There is no rechecking. They just get sealed again and they move on. Anyone in private depository, this would not stand muster. This would trigger investigations. This would potentially lead in someone being arrested. But here, the United States, or at least the holders of America's gold, are actively doing this. And, we're not allowed to ask questions. And anyone who does ask questions is labeled a conspiracy theorist or a kook or whatever. But frankly, the only reason this question, this quote unquote conspiracy theory exists, is because the government has been completely derelict in their duty to ensure that audits are done properly. Audits are supposed to reestablish or reaffirm the trust and the confidence, and these have seemingly done the opposite. So there has been a lot of question as to whether or not the gold is physically there. So we'll start with that. Decades ago, they opened the doors, they brought some Congress people in, they brought in a camera, they pulled out a few pre-approved gold bars. The congressmen got to hold them. They fondled them. They said, wow, this is great gold. They put the gold back in the box. They put the box back on the shelf, and they walked out. There was not a single assay, not a single audit, not a single weighing, not a single serial number matching. This was not an audit. This was a dog and pony made for TV movie show that they did by bringing cameras in. The issue now is that here we are again several decades later, and we haven't learned. Because here you have Elon Musk talking about the need for a live stream. You know, I want to go in there and bring cameras. Fine. If you want to do that, that's fine. But he and President Trump and everyone else needs to understand that an audit is more comprehensive than that. And simply bringing cameras in and showing us, you know, stacks of boxes is not going to suffice. So that really undergirds and underpins why Congressman Massey's bill here is important. Because like I mentioned, the gold hasn't been audited for a long time. So one, making sure that it's physically there. Two, making sure that it is audited, making sure that the gold is not just physically there, but that it is in fact the gold that it says in the purity that it purports to be. And then third would be a full accounting. This is something that has never happened. You know, and this initiative to audit America's gold is something that dates back to former Congressman Ron Paul, back several decades ago. And while an audit and a inventory is important, we have to get a full accounting of all of the transactions that America's gold has been involved with over the last several decades. So I'm talking about places where the government has either bought or sold gold, but maybe more importantly, places where the gold has been pledged or encumbered, used as in a lease or a swap or in some other financial arrangement that no longer gives the United States taxpayer, who is the true owner of that gold, who no longer gives them ownership outright. They've tied it in some sort of financial arrangement with the Bank of International Settlements, the IMF, you know, other countries. There is a lot of frankly legitimate questions surrounding the status of America's gold, and that's why it's important that Congressman Massey's bill gets passed. I'm actually happy to say that we've also had some calls this week with senators, members of Congress on the Senate side who are interested in sponsoring this bill too. So I think soon here we're going to see another federal initiative on this same topic, giving more and more voice, giving more and more oxygen to this idea that Americans deserve to know the status of their gold. You know, you have now Secretary Bessent talking about remonetizing America's balance sheet. You have Senator Lummis in Wyoming talking about, remonetizing the gold and then using that windfall to do things like buy Bitcoin or things like that. You know, these crazy ideas are getting thrown around, but first and foremost, before any of that can even take place, a full comprehensive audit has to take place.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, my concern would be that some of those boxes are empty with cobwebs and dust in there. So,
and man, that's a really legitimate concern. And frankly, like if they're telling me, you know, for a long time, we've been asking them, me personally in this space for a decade, but people before me too have been asking the government for a long time, hey, we want answers on this. And frankly, if the gold isn't there, that would be a disaster. And if they know the gold isn't there, I understand why they wouldn't want their gold audited or that audit to be made public. It would be a huge disaster. It would be catastrophic as far as the confidence that people have in America as a global power. Because, you know, while gold does not explicitly have any tie to the US dollar anymore, it still implicitly supports and buttresses the United States economy. There's a reason the United States has the largest gold stockpile in the world that we know of, at least, because as you've probably read, China and some of these other places are actively hoarding gold, and they're doing it quietly. They're not releasing it publicly. And I get why they would want to do that. So if the U.S. government came to me and said, then no, this is a national security issue, we can't let you in. We know that the gold's not there and we don't want that going out. That's a different story. That's a different question. But for now, frankly, these taxpayers, we need to know, we deserve to know what is behind those vault doors.
Yeah, for sure. And I really just appreciate the work that you all are doing, like, because someone needs to be on the ground doing this type of work, you know, and I definitely appreciate that. So
I appreciate that, man.
Are there any more like federal projects that we should be aware of?
Yeah, there are. I also, this week, I had another meeting it's really interesting. What I've found is that so lawmakers are becoming increasingly concerned about the resilience of the financial infrastructure here in the U.S., in part because current rules right now concentrate the bulk of United States gold holdings to a limited distance away from New York. And we're expecting a congressional bill to address this soon. This is like a really antiquated thing that there's this old-timey rule that says that depositories have to be within, or COMEX or CME approved depositories have to be within 150 miles, I believe, of New York City. And New York City was a financial hub, and I believe, if I'm correct, if my understanding is correct, at the time, the reason this rule was put into place the way it was put into place was because they were traveling by horseback. So you had to consider how long does it take a horse to travel, X amount of miles with gold on its back. And what they settled on was 150 miles. The vaults, all the approved depositories have to be within 150 miles. And that is insane. Our leaders had the wisdom to take America's gold holdings and move it into the interior of the country. That's what Fort Knox is. That was them moving the gold outside of the coastal areas and into the country's interior for the sake of protection. And in the case of a black swan event, so like a hurricane or like, God forbid, an infectious disease that the government feels like it has to respond to, or even like growing geopolitical tensions, the current rules force the majority of the gold to be in that little corner, that tiny little sliver of the country. And so this like creates a national security issue in some ways. You have a massive choke point. The majority of the global reserve asset that is the greatest money of all time exists only in a tiny corner of the country. Meanwhile, you have like Asian countries that are building out this infrastructure in ways that are unseen here in the United States for individuals and industries to interface with. And here, what we're doing is a quote unquote, like, that's the way we've always done it. So that's what the rule is going to be. And that sort of approach, that fuels the risks that we're seeing, what these lawmakers are just now waking up to. We've seen these dislocations before. We've seen, obviously, COVID caused dislocations where it was difficult to get gold from the eastern part of the country to the western part of the country, or from New York to London. We're seeing it now more recently with things like tariffs, where it's difficult to get just gold from one place to another. These dislocations are the result of not mitigating the risks that come with completely concentrating all of your gold in this one little corner. This is a bottleneck that like amplifies risk. It amplifies price, probably. It makes the entire process less efficient, where gold can only be in certain places. So to expand potential depository locations could unlock real upside. You're increasing diversity in your geographic locations of gold and silver. People out west are completely unrepresented right now by this global financial asset and the infrastructure that supports it. So more and more talk about expanding the base where these depositories exist. And I'm excited to say that we're expecting legislation on that soon in Congress that would hopefully result in an increase of some of these gold depositories.
Yeah, that's exciting to hear and everything. So could you share a little more to the gold itself? I mean, there's been some talk about revaluation of gold, and I imagine there's some legal process or legislation process that it has to go through or whatnot. Has that been talked about again, or is that just something that just came out on the Fed site?
You know what? That's actually an interesting question. There was on the Fed site, that report that you're referencing there was a good report that came out. The Federal Reserve, I believe, Bank of St. Louis published that report, and they spoke about remonetizing gold's holdings. It's interesting to note, or maybe even important to note, that if you look at that report, footnote 1 of that report specifies that the conversations thus far that have taken place on this topic are in the context of building a Bitcoin strategic reserve. The people talking about this are looking to zap value out of gold, out of current market gold holdings, and funnel it into Bitcoin or other digital cryptocurrencies. So that's an important part to note. People should know that. That's what the ultimate idea is. As far as how that would actually take place, that would be an accounting procedure. I imagine there would be a congressional process there, but I don't really know. It certainly wouldn't be something that Americans would vote for. I don't think the process is clear or laid out as it exists today. But more and more we're seeing why they would do this, and I get why they're thinking cleverly. Gold and silver prices have been on a remarkable run this year. We're approaching, I think at the time of this recording, we're approaching probably near $3,700 an ounce, so we're at like $3,670 or something like that. Silver is up to date, or year to date, up like 45%. So it's important to realize that like this isn't random and it's not coincidence. This volatility is real and it's telling us something. It's a market vote of confidence in this like fiat system that the United States and that the global economy has sort of adopted. You've got these massive price surges that are driven by a perfect storm of persistent inflation. You've got persistent inflation, which like erodes the dollar's value, the dollar's purchasing power. So individuals are questioning this, but institutions and governments too are looking at the value erosion of the dollar's purchasing power. They're looking at massive U.S. government spending. They're looking at the U.S. government's propensity to kick people out of the financial system that they do not agree with or that they do not abide by. That was obviously increased after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in, I believe, 2022. And so, and these global conflicts that are, started as maybe trade wars, and there's cold wars, and now we're ever increasing into hot wars. So the central bank rally that has driven this totally makes sense. And frankly, people are worried now. Wait, did we miss the boat? Are we too late? And no, they aren't. There's so much slush and liquidity and malinvestment, frankly, that has to be sucked out of the system. And the global liquidity will go to, like I mentioned, non-political, non-inflatable money. And that's gold. And that's what we're seeing today. On top of that, you've got like this questions of silver, like on a manufacturing or on an industrial metal side, demand for EVs, demand for solar panels, things like that. So this really is like the perfect storm. It's this perfect condition. Darrell, do you remember that movie, The Perfect Storm? It's in like the 2000, the George Clooney movie, right? Mm-hmm. Where like you had this ship that was out, I believe in the Atlantic, and so you had this hurricane coming down from Canada down south, and then you have a low pressure system moving, in the other direction, and then you had a cold front coming in from New England that created the perfect storm of destruction and fury, and it cost people lives, it cost literal property destruction, human destruction. And this is where we are. This is a metaphor for where we are. The stars have aligned in such a way that gold holders are the beneficiaries to this reawakening that gold is not a barbarous relic. It is not an outdated, outmoded, just pet rock that sits there. It is still the cornerstone of the global economy.
Yeah. And it seems like just the decades of cheap money, I mean, low interest rates, artificially low interest rates and such, has caused people to forget that. And this is actually reminding folks of what
exactly. And you're totally right, because it's that people were lulled, people were rocked to sleep in an era of deficit spending, in an era of credit. And, while the rest of the country, while places like Asia are stockpiling gold, not just their government, but individuals and families who there's so much ownership there on an individual level, unlike anything that exists in the Western side of the world. And so, now Americans are like, wait, hold up. You mean to tell me that the Federal Reserve note isn't the best money? What do you mean counterparty risk? What do you mean countries are abandoning U.S. treasuries? What do you mean? And all of this is frankly the fault of central planners who told Americans that it would be okay, that in 1971, when we removed that final link to gold, it would just be a temporary measure, is what they called it back then, and that we have the brightest minds working on it. We exchanged our gold standard for a PhD standard, And what we have now is exactly the way supporters of Austrian economics and free market economics said that it would go: exploding deficits, exploding debt, inflation pinching the poorest among us. So this isn't an accident. It's not an act of God that this is happening. These are the result of policy choices. And so to that end, it's important to realize that we can change them. This isn't written into stone. We can re-implement systems that don't require the trust or the judgment of politicians to make these decisions on our behalf. And that's what gold and silver offer.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So share a little more about the index and the ranking of states and things of that nature. I think that could be a good resource for the audience.
Yeah, thanks, man. This is actually something we put out every single year. We call it the Sound Money Index. This is a ranking of all 50 states and their policies pertaining to gold and silver. So you can see here, and I can actually send this to you, Darrell, if you want to post this, and you can also find it on our website. But so we rank all 50 states based on their pro or anti policies pertaining to gold and silver. So these are policies like their sales tax standing, whether they tax the purchase of gold and silver, capital gains, whether they tax the sale of gold and silver, gross revenue tax, commercial activity tax, all of these little taxes that the state imposes on either precious metals investors or precious metals dealers. We work to eliminate all those. Whether a state has reaffirmed gold and silver as constitutional money, whether it has established physical gold reserves, either in its rainy day funds, its reserve funds, or in their pension funds, whether they have issued or invested in gold bonds, and their stance on things like dealer harassment laws, which we spoke about earlier. So it's a very robust scorecard that really takes into account all of the most important things that gold and silver investors would want to have taken note of. In our case, 40% of the index comes from taxes. The reason for that is because the Sound Money Defense League and I have said for a long time, taxes are the single greatest impediment to people using gold and silver today as money. More than legal tender status, more than any other policy initiative, taxes create the friction that make it impossible to work as money. So it has to be a priority to remove those. So this year, in 2025, I'm happy to say that legislatively, it was our most successful year yet. We had more than 30 states across the U.S. introduced and considered pro-gold and silver legislation, more than a dozen signed legislation into law. So I'm telling you that like nearly 75% of the states in this country are actively thinking about how they can re-implement gold and silver. This used to be a niche thing, and it's not anymore. Both because states are realizing that they should be protecting their taxpayers and their balance sheets, but also because individuals are saying, hey, wait, our dollar is dying and there has to be an alternative. And right now, the governing system, the state government, creates too many disincentives for us to create an alternative. We're on a sinking Titanic and the government has locked up all the remaining lifeboats. So we have to unlock those to unlock the power of gold and silver as money. And like I said, all of this long term, I think, is going to be bullish for the metals, because not just the innovation in this space, but the truth is, I have seen very little evidence that the government plans on stopping its spending. Left or right, D or R, the Leviathan will continue to grow. And so if the thesis, if the outlook is that deficit spending will continue, government growth will continue, America will go further into debt, then of course the obvious answer there is to invest in items that lack counterparty risk, items that are, or assets that are not the liability of someone else, like, for example, the US dollar is. And so that's kind of what people are thinking now, that we have to be investing in, we're waking up to alternatives. We've never had alternatives in this space, and now we're starting to.
Yeah, for sure. And, and money that can't be inflated away, so that's I mean, at a 1% rate per year, that's pretty astonishing. So how can people support, be involved and such? I mean, it's easy for me to sit back and be like, all right, JP and them, they got that taken care of or whatnot. Are there ways for people to support these causes and things of that nature?
There are definitely ways to support the cause, and frankly, it's a crucial ingredient of all of the policy projects that have passed over the last 12 years that the Sound Money Defense League has been doing this. The grassroots pressure, hearing from people in the state, is truly what makes a difference. So Darrell, you specifically, you more than others maybe, your voice at the time when Washington, because we're already working with legislators in Washington to reinstate the exemption that these politicians axed. So we're trying to get gold and silver tax-free again. And people in the state is ultimately what make that difference. You know, me putting a suit on and going and testifying, that's one thing, but there is no tool as powerful as a legislator walking into Capitol Hill or walking into their state legislative building and seeing 10, 15 emails in their inbox about an issue, because states typically aren't used to that kind of organized pressure. So if you can get a dozen phone calls and emails, that's enough to make state politicians be like, whoa, hey, hang on, we got our hands on something here. So I think a big part of it is like be an active participant in your legislature, in your state legislature, I should say, because the truth is, yeah, we in general probably don't have a lot of power in Washington, D.C. You know, you can call your congressman, you can write your congressman, an intern might receive the message, you might get like a form response back probably, but that's kind of the result of it. But at the state level, in places like Olympia, in places like Lincoln, Nebraska, in Frankfort, Kentucky, you still have power as an individual in those state buildings. So I encourage everyone to use it. The way you can use it, or the way you can be attuned or kept abreast of these policy projects, is by going on our website, checking this out, soundmoneydefense.org. There you can find a sign-up, a little sign-up form where we ask for your email address and your zip code. The reason we do that is because in our back end, we segment all of these by zip codes. So if you're in a state like Washington, for example, and I know that there's a policy project there, I'm going to draft up an email that lays out the entire policy project. I'm going to include contact information for all of the key people on the committee, email addresses, phone numbers, and in most cases, I'll even draft up a pre-typed message. All you have to do is sign it. I make it so easy. You click here and then you click send. And so it's a very easy to participate, and it's so powerful. It's such a powerful tool. So I encourage anyone, if you look at the Sound Money Index and you say, man, my state's at the bottom, or if you're in one of these good states that's thinking about making a bad decision and you want to be involved, please reach out, join our list. You're going to get the emails when the policy projects are pertaining to you, not for all of the other states that don't pertain to you.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be in touch with you about that and everything. So appreciate you giving that plug there. Well, what else can people find on the site or whatnot? I know that you all are owned by Monetary Metals and such, and so anything else you want to share with the audience before we wrap up?
It's Money Metals. Money Metals Exchange is the precious metals. They're a bullion dealer, depository. They support this project. So I will say, if you have heard of any of these projects over the last 12 years, if you've heard about your state removing sales tax or removing capital gains tax, there's a very strong likelihood that the reason that happened was because of Money Metals' support. They are, to my knowledge, the only dealer in the space that actively supports sound money legislation, that fights and advocates for their customers. So I encourage everyone listening to this, support the people who support us. If you like what we do, check out Money Metals. They provide good items, but also provide good resources. Their news site is I go daily to check out the news articles that they're putting out, the content, the analysis, the commentary. So it's great stuff. I encourage everyone to check that out over there. And then you can find us at soundmoneydefense.org. You can find me on Twitter or X at JP Cortez 27, or the Sound Money Defense League at Sound Money Def. And you can look out for some upcoming publications. We give out a scholarship every year, and the deadline for that is in late October. So if you're a high school senior or if you're in college and you want to make some money writing about why gold and silver matter or about gold standards or central banks, please check us out. This is, I believe, our 10th year giving away this scholarship. We also do a fellowship where we invite graduate researchers and more advanced investigators to produce content. It's a paid opportunity. And on top of that, we're also doing things like the Sound Money Index, publications like this, the Sound Money Review, which is a prestigious journal we'll be putting out later this year that highlights all of the contributions from people who have written about gold standards and about sound money from decades prior. You know, these are academic papers that have been lost, that have been forgotten about, and we're trying to reemerge them, to reimmortalize them, because a lot of them are still relevant to the world we live in today. So creating publications like that, we're working our best to not just help on the legislative side, not just the policy side, but on the education and the resource side as well.
Yeah, appreciate that. Well, you all be sure to go check out Money Metals as well as Sound Money Defense League. So appreciate you for coming on, JP, and looking forward to having a discussion with you again sometime.
Sounds great, Darrell. Thank you for having me, man. It's a great chat.